I'm Tyler, and this is the AntiSocial Network.
Don't look away. Let the fear wash over you.
How? How do you manage every time to pick open a wound to a fresher hell?
Welcome to your number one source of internet oddities.
My IQ is the highest among all Reddit.
That's not saying much.
Here we host conversations with interesting people across the internet.
There's something beyond the direct physical observable world. You can't quantify, you can't put under a microscope. If you don't want to, immediately adopt the Muslim understanding of that, that's fine. You'll get there eventually.
You haven't heard of them, but I have.
It's not just witchcraft, it's nerds. You guys are nerds. My parents didn't let me read Harry Potter, not because of the demonic elements. They just didn't want me to be a nerd.
Join us every Friday for discussions on culture, entertainment, politics, religion, and whatever happens to catch our fancy that week.
I've always deemed myself an evil capitalist.
Because that's how they get you. They get in your head. They start making you ask funny questions. And before you know it, bang, you're a liberal.
I thought it was a matter of record.
Social credit deducted.
You're probably thinking this is some pretty deep stuff, and you're right.
This week we are joined by Darth Raider 117, as she is known on Twitter. I don't know how much of her non-anonymous identity she wants to be identified as, so for all intents and purposes, you shall know her as Darth Raider going forward. She was one of my Twitter friends, and she's rapidly become one of my dear IRL friends, and she's here today to talk to us about her journey away from creationism. How are you tonight?
I am very excited to talk about this journey because it's been several years in the making, or my whole lifetime really. So,
indeed, and we talked
into it.
We talked about it a lot, both off screen prior to now. So obviously, this is something we're both kind of deeply invested in as Christians and as autodidacts, as it were. But it just to start out with, how cold is it for you right now? Because it's frigging. Did Illinois get hit with the frigging cold wave this week, or is it just me?
No, it's pretty frozen up here. Like there was frost on my car this morning, and my kids still just wanted to wear their sweaters, and I'm like, look, there's ice on the car. You have to wear your coats, and it's like really hard to get them to wear their coats, but the ice convinced them. So yeah, it's pretty cold.
All right, because I got the darn global warming hit Tennessee too, and I had to wear extra warm underlayers for the last 3 days just because it's so cold in my own apartment nonetheless. Like I can't even.
I'm so sorry for you, like 2 states further south than I am, that you have to be cold. But
I've become such a thin blood living down here. Like every time I come to Illinois, I turn into a wimp. It's like, oh.
I've only been gone like a year, so you need to just get over it.
Oh my goodness. But yeah, so obviously you've grown up, I won't say where, greater Chicagoland area near where I lived. So we kind of had relatively similar backgrounds in that regard, because it's, that area of the world is, you kind of got we have the very kind of same intersection of fundamentalism that's pretty much pretty universal in experience if you're growing up in the suburbs that for our generation and for generations prior to us, although for us probably less of a force. Hey, premium content. So I guess just to start out with, let's go into your faith background a bit and kind of how you came to where you are.
So I was raised independent fundamental Baptist, and they were of the super legalistic variety, where not only was the doctrine very strict literal interpretation of the Bible, but they added all of these standards like women could not wear pants because the Bible says in Deuteronomy that a woman cannot wear the apparel of a man, and pants are a man's apparel. And there was just a lot of rules. There was rules about how short or long men's hair had to be. There was a ton of rules about our clothing. I was raised in a Baptist school that was affiliated with my church. I went to a mega church. So I was just raised in this total bubble of biblical literalism, and just constantly taught from infancy that everybody else was going to hell. Everybody of every other religion was going to hell, and even other varieties of Christianity, people were going to hell. So there was just a huge emphasis on being separate from the world and staying in our own bubble and not being corrupted by anything worldly. So worldly music, welding movies, couldn't go to movie theaters, couldn't really associate with anyone from the outside, unless we were witnessing. So you know what confrontational soul winning is? You know what that is, right?
Is that the guys in the yellow
We
vests
just
who stand
people.
outside of the train station in Chicago and yell people that they're going to hell, or is that something different?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
So you were the one that
Go
yelled
ahead.
at me in college that I was going to hell. Great.
Yup. Yeah. So like ever since whenever we turned 12, we just got recruited into the soul winning ministry, and we had to go out every Saturday to Chicago and ask all of the people that we could possibly talk to if they knew they were going to heaven when they died. Yeah, I'm all for, sharing testimony and witnessing and things like that, sharing our faith. But the way that we went about it was just very methodical. They trained us. We had tracks. We memorized the verses. We went over the verses with each person. We got them to say the prayer. Boom, they were saved. If we could, we'd get them to ride a bus to church and get baptized, and they were a number. So basically, they prided themselves on how many numbers, how many people said the prayer, how many people came to get baptized, and they would like bribe people to come and get baptized. And we all thought that we were literally saving these people from hell, And I would be 12, 13 years old, going up into apartments with my 12-year-old friend, going up to the top floor of apartments in the inner city to just knock on doors and to witness to anybody that we found. And that's not actually very safe. They would literally just drive us up there, drop us off little kids by ourselves in Chicago, and we would just talk to everyone. But I do think that everybody in Chicago knew about us and had like this understanding, like to humor these people, not mess with them, things like that. But it was quite the adventure. But of course, we were taught the 6-day creation story, that the earth was 6,000 years old, that evolution was a lie from the devil. So we weren't taught anything about science. We were basically just taught not to ask questions, not to think about things too hard, and that everything in the Bible was literal, which after I got older and read the Bible, there's some parts of it that aren't that great, and they never focused on those parts. So probably up until 2 years ago, I was still a young earth creationist, and I guess my introduction to figuring out the truth about things was actually that I just couldn't reconcile the concept of hell with the concept of a loving God. So I was asking questions about hell, 10 years ago, 12 years ago. Even when I was younger, I would think about hell all the time because the church they'd send people out to other countries. They were constantly putting together missions teams, because our church had thousands, tens of thousands of people, and they put together these mission teams, send them to China. They would have us sing songs about little children falling into a burning hell, and I would just question, like, why are children going to hell? Like, we would literally sing that in church, and they were trying to inject as much pathos as possible into us to get us to surrender to the mission field.
All the unbaptized babies are going straight to HE double hockey sticks. There's no
yeah. Yeah. And like everyone just kind of accepted it, but for thoughtful people that look deeper into things, they're like, this didn't really make a lot of sense. So you had a lot of people growing up and leaving the church because as soon as they received any kind of evidence or education to the contrary, say they went out and they went to a secular college. We weren't supposed to. That was extremely frowned upon, and they tried to brainwash us into going to their college, which I did do. I went to their college. But a lot of people didn't. And so they go out, they start receiving some real education, some real science, and be like, this doesn't line up with what I was taught in church for like the first 18 years of my life. And so it would just kind of cause like their faith to crumble because it would destroy the foundation that everything was built on, which the foundation is that the Bible is literally true. And so that happened to my brother, and that's what kind of really got me into apologetics and wanting to learn more about where the text of the Bible came from, whether or not it was literally true, why do we believe it, the origin of Christianity and things like that. I got into apologetics because I thought I was going to save my brother from going to hell. And then I stopped believing in hell. That was the first thing to go. So,
Tim's really been getting to your head if you don't believe in hell at all. But
what get into my head?
Do you not believe in hell at all, or do you believe that hell is temporary? Because I believe Tim's answer would be that hell is temporary, not that it doesn't exist.
Yeah, Tim made me more of a heretic even than he is. But I don't believe in any kind of eternal conscious torment or any kind of permanent hell. I would say that he thinks there's a separation from Christ until we are reconciled with him. I guess I would say that I believe in that. Perhaps.
Which, if you know,
there's no fiery damnation.
I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole because it's a whole different topic. But I do think that the fire and brimstone version of hell is not useful for anything other than just rank scare tactics. Really depending on how you approach the concept of hell as a topic, and that's where ultimately you're going to find your, the degree to which you understand eternal damnation, because obviously the Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God vision, where you are, a little tiny bug holding onto the side of God's hand, so that you don't get thrown into the fire eternally. That's, it's poetic, but it is not a literally true statement in any reasonable fashion, and I don't think anyone who isn't just taking, the parable of Lazarus ultra literally is going to come to the conclusion that hell is literally a place that's on fire. I mean, the most famous poem about hell is Dante's Inferno, and hell's not on fire. It's cold. It's not on fire in there, so.
Which is ironic. But we were taught about the fires of hell 3 times a week for our entire lives. So I guess that's why I still think of it that way, even though I know a lot of people don't actually think of it that way. In my mind, I equate hell with fire. But
I mean, they basically just take the one line of Jesus saying the words "lake of fire" and say, "Oh, you get thrown into fire." There's no more investigation beyond that.
That's the only thing in the Bible that's not metaphorical. So, yeah. But
there's no metaphor in the Bible. It's all literally true. Hans Fine, a Lutheran satire, I saw him on Twitter recently say, he's like, I don't think the parables are fiction. I think they might actually be true. And I'm like,
even the parables. I didn't go that far. That's good.
Yeah. You're not as fundamentalist as the Lutherans. Oh my, that's a take. But yeah, I mean, I don't think my background was ever as I would say definitely my background was never as legalistic as that. My grandparents were definitely of that strain of baptism. Like I told you, I recently had my grandmother's Bible rebound as a gift to my grandfather for his 80th birthday. And when I took a look at it recently, it was a Schofield Reference Bible, which, if you're familiar with the history of that Bible, you know that that's where the entire concept of the rapture and the pop culture version of the apocalypse comes from. Not any version of Christianity.
Yeah, that was a big deal for us.
Yeah, not any version of Christianity before that reference Bible, but every basically the entire Baptist faith after that adopted his vision of all the Christians get called forward in the rapture, then there's a tribulation and a literal 1,000-year kingdom on earth, and then a final battle in a city called Armageddon, and the Left Behind version of Christianity that's thin as a thimble. There's no depth to it at all, but it's popular.
Yeah, and that was so real to me. It was so real to me that when I was in grade school, I would pray that we would all get raptured, so I wouldn't have to give my book report because I was too shy to give a book report. Even though I knew that would just damn all of the non-Baptists to hell for all of eternity, I didn't care. I just didn't want my book report, so I didn't want to give a speech.
You know,
I wanted to be raptured.
That's a very 10-year-old innocent thought when you really think about it. You know, it's, you know, I want to go I want to go to heaven so I don't have to do my book report. You know.
Yeah.
Well, you know, and maybe there's something to that. We are supposed to have the faith of children, but not the mind of children, as some people probably need to be reminded. Right. But
if we all had the mind of children, a lot more people would be in danger. But
some people nowadays, but I don't know. In any case, what I guess recently you read Ben Stanhope's Misinterpreting Genesis, which I read and I loved, and I just read The Lost. Yes, exactly. And I just read The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton, which I also loved a lot. It's kind of felt like the book behind Ben Stanhope that I didn't realize I needed to read, but we both kind of walked down the same path. Like I said, I didn't have the same kind of legalistic faith, but whenever I talk to atheists, I always hear the legalistic argument that you talked about, which is why so many people fall away, because they bounce off their religion at a young age and they just never comes back to it. Or in the case of young Christians nowadays, they bounce off of the Baptist church and then decide to become tradcaths and declare the Western world the new Babylon, and decide they want to basically just convert all of America to Catholicism, which good luck with that. But it seems like nowadays, like, that version of the Baptist church just bounces young people off unless they're just completely contented in it. But in our cases, we both kind of did, but it seems like we just kind of came to a more heterodox version of it, more so than anything else. And in our case, we both read books that we just kind of affirmed our priors by reading books.
Yeah, exactly. I just tried to make up for the education that I never got, and I think we both just are trying to seek the truth. Like we are both looking for what's actually true and not trying to confirm our own biases, I guess. And that's kind of a scary journey to take, because honestly, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and have been at risk of you know, it's easy for me to see the atheist side of the argument and the agnostic side, and it's definitely not black and white. You know, there's a lot of questions that I have that are definitely not answered. I've uncovered a lot of lies, and then every time that you uncover a lie, you have to make up for that in some way with another truth.
You don't have to get rid of the cat. It's premium content on the internet. Just
Yeah, who doesn't want to look at a fluffy cat?
I know.
You're distracted with it.
I know, but
something that I thought was interesting was that Ben Stanhope did start out wanting to be an apologist. That's how he started out his own journey to where he is now, and then he got into studying ancient Hebrew languages and the biblical texts and things like that. But he just started out wanting to be an apologist, which is kind of what happened to me. I'm not going to learn any ancient languages, though, because I just trust other people to do that for me who are smarter.
There are some autodidacts that learn Hebrew and like self-teach that way through it, but that is a level of commitment that is impressive to the point of being impractical. To that, I highly doubt I'm ever going to successfully learn a second language at this point. But you know, kudos to people like Ben Stanhope for actually putting the work in and doing it. Like, we need that, because there's so much.
We need people like him.
Yeah, I mean, any reasonable argument about this stuff ultimately comes down to what does it mean in the original text? What is the authorial intent? Which is not what you get when you talk to, you know, Reverend Schofield and the Independent and Fundamentalist Baptist Church. You're not going to get that from there, because the exegetical lens for so much of fundamentalist Christianity is that it has to be true along one particular axis, and that is usually that there's no vagary as to the actual historicity and literal impact of what's happening in the text. So if the Bible says the earth was created in 6 days, then there's no room for vagary as to what that means. That means the Earth was created in 6 days, and it's 6 24-hour days as we understand it. The two people came out looking essentially like us, and they acted like us, and they spoke like us, and they had feelings like us. And as John Walton says, that's kind of the great mistake of so much of modern Christendom, is just this, I guess, what, to borrow a C.S. Lewis term, chronological snobbery, where we assume that our understanding of the Bible is better.
I was thinking arrogance, but that's a good way to put it.
Well, he uses that word in reference to mostly towards atheists who think that everything in the past is inferior to the future. But in this case, it applies totally, because if you, reading your King James Bible, think you have by reading Genesis 1, think that you have a greater understanding of life in the universe than the person that wrote Genesis 1, you're kind of deluding yourself a little bit, which, but at the same time, there's also that, the quarter redneck in me, who's, the little devil on my shoulder. I just hear him in my voice saying, like, well, why would they write it if it wasn't that? Why would you want to make it confusing? It says 6 days. That means it's supposed to be 6 days. What's wrong with you, boy? And I'm just like, and there's a fair point, and there's a non straw man version of that argument too. Friends of mine who are more exegetically serious, who do actually spend time going back and reading the Church Fathers or reading the commentaries of Calvin and Aquinas and other people from across the history of the Christian faith, a lot of them default to 6 day, which is probably the more interesting challenge for me, because obviously, if Bubba Joe's Seventh-day Adventist Church down the road says the Earth is 6,000 years old, that's very different than Augustine of Hippo saying that the world is 6,000 years old. So it kind of becomes the challenge becomes what is our lens through understanding the scriptures? How do we apply it in a way where we are able to take knowledge away from this book in a way that doesn't compromise our ability to do so? Because, on one hand, you have the Catholic answer that says, the Earth isn't 6,000 years old, but we have the authority to say that, so you can shut up and not question us. Or you have the Episcopalian answer that says that Paul is a sexist, and that anything that that's icky and modernized doesn't have to be read, and we don't have to read Leviticus because it's icky. So we just, we show up to church and we play banjos and feel happy about ourselves. Becomes so
better.
It becomes so exegetically liberal that the Bible essentially just stops existing. you know what I mean? It's kind of hard to find that sweet spot. It's just like a
feel-good hippie religion at that point, with the Bible as a prop for credibility. So
yeah, you ever seen the Queen James Bible?
What?
You ever seen the Queen James Bible?
I have never heard of that.
There's an LGBT friendly Bible, and you can find it on Amazon. It's called the Queen James Bible, and it's covered in pride stripes.
That sounds like a really fun read. They actually changed the.
I don't know what the deal is. I'm assuming they took out the references to homosexuality, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
There is no Sodom and Gomorrah in that Bible. There's none.
Although the funny thing about that is the liberal answer to Sodom and Gomorrah is that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was being an uncourteous host. And my first thought is to turn to the Norm Macdonald line. The problem with Bill Cosby is it's the hypocrisy. Actually, no, it was the rape. The good job. You've successfully eliminated Sodom and the entire.
I mean, if you could eviscerate people for being uncourteous hosts, that would be nice. But it's overkill.
Based. So I guess when did your journey turn towards people like John Walden and Ben Stanhope, and how did you kind of come to that conclusion? Because it's still a pretty heterodox opinion to be pro, 6 billion year old universe and evolution in the Christian church.
So that's pretty fresh. I started out with asking questions about hell, and some of the people I met online, like Tim, introduced me to a lot of literature on hell, eschatology, the problem of evil, things like that. And that was when I was first introduced to the idea that evolution was true. And at first, I could not wrap my mind around that, because if evolution is true, Adam is not the first man. And if Adam was not the first man and Eve was not the first woman, what meaning did the fall have? Was there a fall? What was going on prior to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? Like, I still took all of that very literally. Although I had, just because I exposed myself to a lot of stuff, I was already aware of questions like, how did starlight reach us if the Earth is only 6,000 years old? Well, the answer is God created an aged universe. That's easy to solve. He just created the light here where we could see it. But then that incident kind of corresponded with some geology research that I was doing. There was a YouTube channel that I follow by Nick Zentner. He's a geologist for the University of Washington. He has an incredible channel. And I got kind of addicted to his channel and watching all the videos because I have a whole separate interest in natural disasters. So earthquakes, volcanoes, all of that. So then I was kind of killing like multiple birds with one stone by watching that channel. And then him talking about the history of the Pacific Northwest and all of that. I was like, there's no way all of this happened in 6,000 years. There's no way. There's no way that the flood could lay down all of these layers. There's no way all of these super volcanic eruptions would be happening within 6,000 years. It's not like there's time during the flood for the Yellowstone supervolcano to erupt 17 times. It's just not. So there was just a ton of scientific evidence that I was taking in, as well as the literature that I was reading from apologists and scholars and things like that. And finally convinced me that, okay, the Earth is old. The universe is old. But maybe people weren't here until 6,000 years ago. Maybe God had created everything in readiness for mankind, and then he just created the creatures, the animals, the people, and all of that. But then I started researching paleoanthropology and things like that. And so this was all probably this year. And Tim was making the argument that we evolved, we have a common ancestor with primates. And I was just like, no, we don't have a common ancestor with primates because that would make us animals. We're not animals. We're a whole separate thing from the animal kingdom. God created us separately from them.
I'm reminded of the line from the book Killer Angels, where the Confederate soldiers are arguing about whether or not man evolved from apes or not, and they came to the conclusion that, well, you, my good sir, may have evolved from an ape, but General Lee most certainly did not. So, yeah, it definitely feels like there's kind of a discomfort with that concept, which is even I get that kind of feeling where there's something weird and off-putting about it being what it is. But
because like at one point, did we cross some kind of threshold where we are children of God, I guess, or we are conscious or sentient enough to be in communion with God and to sin and to have moral responsibilities and all that. So then I'm like having all of those questions, which I haven't resolved any of that yet. It's just very fun to think about.
Well, there's a good video by Jonathan Pageau, who's an Orthodox icon carver, when he was asked, is the Earth 10,000 years old or not? And the answer he gave was actually a really interesting needle thread answer, where he says, the history of humanity is 10,000 years old, which is a very fair statement, because everything that basically exists up through humanity prior to the Bronze Age, Babylon, Sumeria, basically the very earliest version of humanity after we developed agriculture, that's only 10,000 years, which is
insane to think about.
Yeah, like, if there's a pretty compelling case to be made that, if you're Christian, that the first 90,000 years of human history, man was just another animal, and then one day humanity just wakes up and suddenly everything happens. And that's not unprecedented, because human civilization seems to operate as a kind of escalation. Like, even just in the last 200 years, like, we've advanced more than we did in the previous 10,000, just because of how fast technology has been allowing new technologies to come out in its wake. So
it's just continuously exponential.
Yeah.
So
humanity seems to exist on an exponential growth curve. And whatever the experience of the first human being was that, looked up into the sky for the first time and realized that he was conscious and that there's something out there in the world that he doesn't understand, that set us on the path. And it dates basically to the same moment that the Bible dates humanity, which is 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, which, depending on how you read it, because the genealogies are not clear. But when you take that into account, even the genealogies are less of a problem, because if you don't have to pretend like that, like the entire history of humanity happened in 6,000 years. But it definitely, because even in a world where Yahweh comes down to one Jewish guy in the middle of the desert and says, "I'm gonna make you the father of my people," that can still mostly line up with the history we know, and there's plenty and at that point it mostly just kind of clicks into place, because we know Israel was real, we know that Egypt was real, we know most of the pharaohs mentioned in the Old Testament were real, we know most of the Assyrian kings and the Babylonian kings were real. So at that point it just becomes another piece of history at that point. And obviously there's like squabbling over things like David, but if you depending on how literally you want to take some of the Old Testament stuff, because there's a lot of academic contention that the books tended to be written significantly after the fact, not as documentary, or not in the sense of a documentary where it's happening at that moment, but
as like propaganda, right?
I wouldn't say that. Like, I just watched a documentary on the Book of Daniel, and the academic who wrote it claimed that it was written a couple decades before Christ and not during the time of the Babylonian captivity. Just because he says, it's because there's references to historical events that someone who was alive during the Babylonian captivity wouldn't have known about. I'm like, yeah, but it also claims to be a book of prophecy, so it just depends when it was written. I don't know. Like, maybe it was written after the fact, and because I've heard it very commonly said that the ancients kind of intermingled all genres of literature into one in a way that's kind of perplexing to the modern mind, where we have a very firm division of fiction and nonfiction, and they didn't appear to have had that. They kind of rolled poetry and mythology and history into one bundle and just kind of let it unfurl before them. It was like a great tapestry, which is kind of why the Bible, if you read books like Isaiah or Ezekiel, it'll just change genres like every other paragraph. It'll be like, it's a poem at one point, then it's the history of an Assyrian king, and then another poem, and it just keeps going back and forth. It's kind of this fascinating intermingling of genres that kind of makes it hard to parse what the narrative is supposed to be or what the full authorial intent is.
And I have no idea about any of that, because I was not taught how to read the Bible. I wasn't taught about genres. I was only taught that it's a literal book, and it's a bunch of commandments, the history book, and it's an instruction manual. And that is a pretty poor way to read something like the Bible. So I don't think that I read the Bible properly, or that I get out of it what I am supposed to get out of it. I feel like I'm on a learning curve with that.
That's true. I think that, but even Ben Stanhope says that the majority of the Bible is relatively comprehensible. Most of it's not throwing curveballs at you. It's mostly meant to kind of give you enough of a grasping to build a sense of your own metaphysic, or to more accurately to participate in a established metaphysic that lets you kind of experience this culture and this tradition. And obviously, the New Testament throws a lot of that into kind of chaos by undoing a lot of the Old Testament laws. So it's complicated as to what you are expected to do in line with the tradition. And obviously with the Protestant Reformation, that tradition became even more complicated because we threw out even more of it. Where the Catholics kind of pretend that they're the continuation of the Jewish high temple tradition, which I say that mainly because some Catholics kind of would probably chafe at that concept, but at the very least, from a pure liturgical standpoint, you can draw roots to a lot of Catholic liturgy in the Old Testament's vision of liturgy. So, especially with you and I being of the more thoughtful Protestant traditions, there is kind of a confusion as to how much of this we're supposed to rebuild from the ground up, and how much we're supposed to apply, and which parts to apply where and when.
Yeah, it can be very confusing and overwhelming to think about what I'm supposed to actually apply and what I'm supposed to reject and I don't know. I read this book called The Crucifixion of the Warrior God by Greg Boyd. It's like a 2,000-page book all about Old Testament exegesis, about the violence text and things like that. And that was really enlightening about how we should interpret the violence text of the Old Testament. But at the same time, it just made the Bible seem even more or even less concrete or stable to me, because the way that we interpret those violence texts, according to him, is that we should use this principle of accommodation, where God is not actually endorsing or engaging in that kind of violence, but his people are warrior people who believe in warrior gods, so they're ascribing these values to God that God doesn't have, and then God just kind of meets them where they're at. And so when the text is being written, they're writing things about attributes that God doesn't have, and deeds that God did not sanction or do, but nevertheless that's in the Bible, and people use those incidents as justification for all kind of violent acts. I've
seen two interesting explanations of that. One being that there's an authorial version of that where it's violent because the people who wrote it are violent, and the other version of that I heard is the Dennis Prager answer, which is the Canaanites got everything they deserved because they were that bad. There's I don't like the Crusader argument where you can run into a Muslim village and behead them for heresy. Like I don't want to interpret Christianity that liberally, because I don't think that's what Jesus would have wanted us to do. But that does create tension. You're right, though. It definitely feels like there is a discord between the Old Testament and the New Testament, although I don't think it's as much of a discord depending on how you use it, because I do think that there is supposed to be a unity to the book. It's not just a case of the Old Testament is the wrathful God, the New Testament is the graceful God, because the God that appears through both halves is the same God ultimately, and you do see his character threaded both as graceful in the Old Testament and wrathful in the New Testament. So it's not like there's a singular character to it. It's easy. One could just say it's the same character. It's the same God interacting with different people at different times, like you said, where Bronze Age people not going to be super responsive to what Jesus has to say.
The peace and mercy and love God.
Yeah, exactly. But you're right. It's hard. But at the same time, I don't think that the Jewish God is also as wrathful as people tend to give him credit for, despite being the guy who basically calls for a wholesale genocide of the Canaanites. Like the Bible, it's very clear in the Bible that whatever happens in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges, the Jews don't end up ultimately genociding the Canaanites. They're
everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. They're like, God tells them, go take the land and don't take prisoners and leave no one and don't take them as wives. And lo and behold, they take them as wives because they want to plunder and have little half Canaanite babies. And as a result of that, the Judea gets filled with Asherah poles and Baal worshippers because they just can't. They just refuse to obey. But the point is, he never commanded that in the first place.
So
That they shouldn't intermarry,
but they
or
should. He never commanded. Oh, he didn't command them to genocide everybody. He probably did command them never to marry.
I think there's some spurious commands where he tells Joshua that to go and kill them all, but it's not. It really depends on how you read it and what you're ultimately supposed to take away from the Canaanites, because, like I said with Dennis Prager, there's a case that they just probably were brutal barbarians worshiping false gods. It's like, I don't know. Obviously, we don't want to go full, murder the people we don't like, which we don't. That should not be the primary takeaway as a modern Christian. And I think I think the origin answer generally that we should apply the spirit of that to our own sense of salvation, where we just make no quarter on ourself for sin, which if you do that, then the New Testament actually makes a lot of sense, because that essentially echoes Christ's call to pluck out your eye if it makes you sin, or cut off your arm if it makes you sin. So right. I guess the application of the Old Testament,
which is also not literal.
Well, yeah, exactly. Christ isn't saying I'm sure there's been one or two guys in history that said, "Oh, I can't stop doing something bad, so I don't need that arm anymore."
Right.
I'm sure that's happened, and Origen was famous for committing castration against himself for some reason. So I don't know. I don't think it breaks the text, just like I would argue that hell doesn't break the text, but I also think that the distinctly low church Baptist fundamentalist view of it poisons the well in some ways. And I don't want to be too mean to the Baptists, because especially if you're, did you crash? Are you good?
Yeah. You cut out there. I don't see you now.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
All right. I can see you. Just give it a second.
I can see you now.
All right. Weird. But
that was weird, but
I don't want to be too mean on the Baptists, because obviously I live in the Bible Belt, and
right. And Baptists are amazing, loving, wonderful people. It's just that if they're spreading misinformation in an age where the contrary and true information is readily evident to people, it's going to cause a problem. But
it's also just challenging because they're so utterly resistant to it. Like, I remember I sat next to a Baptist woman a couple of months ago at a concert, and she pulls out her phone and she starts showing me all these photos of nature, and she said, "Look at that, it's so pretty. No evolution would create something that pretty." I'm just like, I don't want to be mean to her. It's, I agree, but I also believe, I fundamentally believe, as a matter of dogma, that the heavens proclaim the glory of God.
Right.
And I also believe that means that the earth is not a false source of information. Unless you believe that
what?
Satan is putting dinosaur bones under the earth, which I don't.
Exactly. Is it there to test our faith? Are all these layers of earth and fossils and buried dinosaur bones there to test our faith, or what? No, God wouldn't do that.
No, it just makes the earth cool. That's what it does. But...
Yeah, this is one of the big sticking points with me was that the deceptiveness that would go into it. Okay, so yes, maybe God would create the earth with age, even if he created it 6,000 years ago. Like, you could carbon date it and be like, this is aged. There are arguments for Adam and Eve having been created as adults. They sound good. Or light from the stars being able to reach us, being created that way sounds good. But when you go and you look at all this evidence of millions and hundreds of millions of years worth of eruptions and layers being laid down and continents shifting all around over the course of millions of years, you can't say, that it would be deceptive of God to create the world that way. It'd be like, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It'd be like he was lying. Why would he do that?
I mean, it goes back to and it goes back to something in Ben Stanhope's book, which is, the Bible is not a work of cosmology, or it's not strictly a book of cosmology. One of his ideas, and one that John Walden goes into a lot, is the idea of the authorial idea you mentioned, that is that the Old Testament is supposed to be a book that was addressed to this very particular culture in a way that they would understand, and that whoever wrote / edited / preserved the books, excuse me, Ice-T wanted to say hi, whoever wrote these books, it was their prerogative to make it understandable. So much of the mythology of it is reflective of the mythology that the Jews would have shared with both the Egyptians and the neighboring Ugarets and Sumerians and Babylonians and Akkadians. So there's references to the earth being flat, there's references to the sky being an ocean, there's references to great chaos dragons that live under the earth, there's the concept of Sheol, which is essentially just the underworld, which is the vague version of hell that you kind of find in all ancient pagan religions, where you just die and you become a shade and you don't really have a form or an identity after death. You just kind of become like a hollow version of yourself, and kind of sort of like hell, but much less descript. It's actually kind of
a depressing afterlife.
And it's also kind of unclear if the Jews actually believed in an afterlife. There's a pretty cogent argument that they didn't. That they just believed in a mortal existence.
And that's why they cared about justice so much more in this current life.
Yes, they would have cared about
so much more on that.
It's also why they would have depicted death in the way they did, as the ultimate enemy, because if they have the sense that there's no afterlife, then yeah, death definitely means a lot more when you're trying to serve a living God that is promising you life and glory and in exchange for your servitude, and yet he's allowing your entire civilization to be handed over to the Babylonians because your neighbor wouldn't stop worshiping Asherah no matter how much you told him not to. But the Old Testament is clearly a work authored to a very particular group of people, and you see that even in the construction, because the narrative starting from creation and the creation of Israel up to the end it's fundamentally about explaining to a group of displaced people how you can simultaneously be the children of God, of not only a parochial God, but the God of the universe, the sole God of creation, and how you're still been screwed over and over again, and you're living in occupation.
It's all their fault. It's all their fault because they're bad.
Yeah, it's like the Dennis Prager joke. You know the Jews were onto something, because no one would ever write a book that makes himself sound that bad. It's one of those great. It's like, it's so perfect. This is the history of a civilization failing and not understanding why it's failing, and then that's the purpose the New Testament serves, is the fulfillment of that history. It's like, oh, you failed on your own, and so I will be the living sacrifice on your behalf and take away the sins of the world for those who follow me. Which,
the cynical interpretation.
Which that is the narrative of the book. It's also really the point. Are you yelling at the cat, or
that can't be the only narrative of the book, because it's.
I mean, if you had to boil down the Bible, it's John 3:16. It's God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life, which is the simplest rendition of the faith humanly possible, except for like the Nicene Creed. It's you can't get any more distinct than God sends the true King to Earth to retake his throne, which I think that's the C.S. Lewis version of it. If you want to fulfill it, to just describe what the Bible is, that's the narrative, but obviously that comes with these complicated presets and presuppositions. And the number one argument I've encountered when explaining the idea of cultural context and authorial intent with the Bible is it seems to undermine the concept that it's God breathed. And it also undermines the concept that someone can read the Bible and attain salvation, because a lot of people are like, well, if there's so much context that goes into understanding what the meaning of Genesis is, then how can I possibly pick up a Gideon Bible and be saved? Which the short answer is you read John 3:16 and you believe it, but it's also it's complicated in the way that any text is complicated, because there's elements of of the background and historicity that you just don't know without background context.
Yeah, that's what's difficult about the Bible, is you cannot have all or nothing. So you're placing something on it that's so important, eternal life, redemption, how we should live our lives, every decision that we make, how we view ourselves and others. You're placing that on a book, and then when you realize that you have to interpret this book more liberally, nobody interprets it the same. We don't know exactly where every part of it came from. We'll never know exactly what all of it means, but we still like applying all this importance to it. That's pretty tricky, right?
Yeah,
and you have to take.
And the questions get harder when you start talking with other denominations too, because the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, they have a half dozen more books than ours Bibles do. So that opens up the question of.
I was going to bring that up about the Apocrypha and the Gnostic Gospels and all this. Like, how is it that we can apply all the importance to what we have in the canon and then totally disregard other stuff?
Well, the answer they would give is that the throne of Saint Peter said so, which is which is the common answer. It's like, the church decided through tradition that these ones are wrong and these ones are right, and you trust the tradition, which is a complicated answer because
I don't trust.
It's a complicated answer because ultimately, as Christians, we believe that the Bible is God breathed, which means it's the book that we're supposed to be reading. Even if you don't believe that every word of it is literal, we ultimately believe that the book that's sitting in our hands is the one we need to attain salvation. And you ultimately have to hope that God put it there in such a way that he would not directly allow you to be compromised by it, unless you're reading a Jehovah's Witness Bible or something like that, which actively mistranslates elements of it. But it is what it is. Like these questions go so far deep into academia and epistemology that I'm just like, there's no way the average person is just gonna be able to come to a conclusion on it. It's just, you're gonna drive yourself crazy. You could spend a lifetime trying to figure this out, and
a lot of people do.
Yeah. And I think that's why so many people come to the answer I did just now, which is you trust the thing that's before you because you don't have another option. And for a lot of people that works. For a lot of people, 6-day creation is the utilitarian answer to the faith, which is, I don't have time in my life to read 5 John Molton books and philosophically rewire the history of the universe in my brain. It's the Earth's 6,000 years old.
It's
done.
A lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, and it drives you insane, and you go mad trying to figure out what the actual truth behind it is, and eventually you just have to come to the conclusion that we don't know, but it's ultimately true. What that means, I don't know.
Not built that way. I'm not built that way.
Yeah, you're probably gonna end up going mad at some point. You're gonna get put into a straitjacket just because you couldn't figure out what the we couldn't figure out how to disprove the canonicity of Maccabees. It's like,
who really killed the firstborn children of Egypt? Or did they ever die? No. But I think ultimately it's pretty clear that the Bible is a story of redemption, and that's all that we really need to take from it as far as what the average person needs. It's obvious. And as far down the rabbit hole as you can go investigating all of these other issues, you can't get around the fact that the Bible is a story of redemption. And I do think you can't get around the fact that there's something divine about it. At least I haven't been able to so far. I haven't been able to convince myself that that's not true.
So obviously we've mercilessly crapped on our fundamentalist friends.
Sorry, fundamentalist friends.
Well, I have some.
Who will never watch this.
Yeah, whoever's viewing this. Hi. What do you think that the response to the liturgical side of thing is? Because like I said, the challenge for me as an adult is not so much that I can't reconcile Joe Bob's at Baptist Church in my own faith, so much as it is when I go back and read church fathers, or when I read people who are actual serious theologians. This tradition just seems to be completely absent, like the idea of the non-literal 6-day creation. Obviously, you get stuff like Augustine's idea of the 6 epochs, which even Ban Stanhope is like, yeah, this theory doesn't make any sense. Like, no one takes the epoch theory seriously who knows anything about biblical theory, critical analysis. Like, how do we deal with the fact that there's not?
So you're asking if you can figure out what is the proper way to worship. Is that what you're talking about? Like, what is the right approach to worship God, or to have a
well,
service?
how do we? Well, my question is, how do we not divorce ourselves so much from tradition that we become completely autonomous? Because I've met a lot of Christians that develop a heterodox belief system, get kicked out of their church, and then they just go off onto their own and hang out with a small group that believes exactly the very specific niche they believe in, and it's
Great
not
question.
and it's not connected to any sort of tradition, and that makes it lose any of its theological or cultural value outside of just being edifying to one person's specific hang-ups with the faith. Like, for this thing to be true, it needs to be universally true, and that means it needs to be applicable to traditions. And the fact that there's not a lot on this front can be concerning, where, you know...
Yeah, that's something that when I first started researching all of this, when I decided that the Baptist faith was not correct, I wanted to find the correct denomination. I wanted to find the right way to worship. I believe that out of all the denominations, I naively thought there was a right one. And I don't think that anymore. I don't think any of them really have it correct. And I know that you made a really good choice with your Anglican church service. You did the best that you could with that as far as being heterodox. But I still don't know a lot about the traditions. I knew nothing about church fathers. I knew nothing about liturgy or liturgical traditions or any of that until, a year ago? So I'm still trying to figure that out. I don't.
And that's fair. Like,
that's why I don't attend a church.
Well, yeah.
I'm one of those.
There you go. I mean, you're not as heterodox as some people I know. I know people that are far more heterodox than you are, but... It's a dangerous position to be in, because we are supposed to be in a communion. We're supposed to be engaging in this, and my greater concern is that if there is a tradition that doesn't ultimately allow space for this, then there's an all bets are off scenario, and then we're just kind of
a tradition that doesn't ultimately allow space for what exactly?
For what we're discussing, the opportunity that this thing that the literalism of Genesis, or some of the more elements of the Old Testament that may or may not be true, like various miracles and such.
So for believers who are aware of science and of the truth, and are not trying to either delude themselves or remain blind to obvious facts about the Bible, is what you're saying.
Yes, I mean it's part of the problem I've engaged as I've joined into the liturgical side of the faith, because obviously they're more sacramental. They're more interested in how our daily interactions with the church renew us and bring us closer to Christ, and how we're supposed to live that out, which I think is the correct formation. But, you know, the Baptist with devil horns on my shoulder, he keeps whispering in my ear, like,
I can't talk
on some level
to people about what I believe.
And you know, but even that, I don't want to say that, because in this case it goes back to the problem with the church fathers and the problem with the older traditions, because so many of them are 6-day too. Like, Augustine believed in the 6th day, and I think most of the church fathers, if not all of them, took Genesis pretty much straightforward. Martin Luther took it straightforward. I'm pretty sure... I don't know what Aquinas' view was, but, you know, Calvin took it straightforward. Like, almost every serious theologian up until the last 200 years, when evolution became a theory, had this as their had this as their theory. And it just kind of raises the question of like, okay, how do you have the churches been in error this entire time just because we didn't know this fact? And is this an acceptable thing in the tradition that we can learn to live with in that doesn't alter our liturgy? Or is the fact that the traditions which claim to be inerrant go back this far and have this rigid of an idea a sign that they're just that the entire faith is too brittle and just doesn't click into reality totally? But this is the most. I don't generally have super atheist thoughts, but this is like the one that's bugged me a lot. Just it's not the Baptist argument. It's the liturgical argument. It's at what point does the tradition break down? Because the tradition, in a lot of ways, it's the thing that preserves Christianity, and it's our oldest connection to the original, to a lot of the original authority.
How does the sixth-day creation play into that tradition?
I'm sorry.
I don't think that tradition hinges on literal six-day creation, does it? I mean, the fact that the church fathers believed in a six-day creation, they can't really be faulted for that because they didn't have the evidence to the contrary. And I don't think it's that important to the faith.
No,
I think the danger now is to keep pushing it when it's obviously false.
No, and I think that's the correct answer. It's just a doubt that lingers in me a lot because I do. It's something that. Well, there's fundamentalists in every tradition, and I've met Orthodox fundamentalists and Catholic fundamentalists, and they think evolution is dumb pants. Like, if you believe in it, you hate Jesus. I'm like, you're supposed to be the intellectual side of the faith, and you're spewing the Baptist arguments. So good job, but so it's one of those things where it's the closest I come to feeling closer to my atheist friends. The question of, at what point does our modern and slightly liberal rendition of these complicated questions break the text irreparably? And I don't know when the line is. Now, obviously, I think the line, it's probably close. It's probably easy to say, if Jesus didn't exist, then the Bible is not true. But I don't think that's
right.
That's an obvious one. That's an obvious one. If Jesus didn't resurrect, then the Bible isn't true. Then he's just a rabbi that died, which is sad. But the Christian is someone who believes that he, was killed and he rose again, and that's the entire proof of their religion is that he did that. And
it's difficult if everybody in the New Testament is espousing something that we all know now is false. Right?
Yeah, and there's references in the New Testament to where Paul and the apostles, and even I think Jesus on one or two occasions refers to Adam as a direct descendant of his, which is, it's complicated. And they talk about David like he's a direct descendant, and that's complicated. So I don't know. Like Jesus of all people would know whether or not Adam was a literal guy or not, or how much of the fall was literal or not. And I'm like, okay, is Jesus literally saying the earth is 6 days old? If not, because if that happens, we're kind of in a pickle. What do we do with that? Like that at that point is like, okay, or it's Jesus against Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Jesus sounds disturbingly like a Baptist in this context. Like, I don't know what to do with this. We are, at that point, it's like that's the point when the text just breaks in my brain. I'm like, okay, I don't know what to do with it at that point. So,
I mean, that's understandable. I've got my own weak points where I sympathize with the atheists very much, and where the Christianity could break down in my brain. As far as, I never really thought about Jesus, like referencing Adam as a direct ancestor of him and having existed.
It might be Paul that does that. I could be wrong, but it's at least the implication in some places.
With Paul. Okay, I got some issues with Paul that are weak points for me.
Oh my gosh, we're gonna have to have one of these conversations, aren't we?
Yes, I could get deep into the issues with Paul.
I'm gonna mail you a headscarf for Christmas, and we're gonna make a proper Pauline out of you. We're gonna fix this. We're not cucking out on Paul. We're not cucking out on Paul.
Come on, you started it.
Paul is inerrant, darn it. There is no.
Just kidding.
Paul is an apostle. You can't fight the apostles.
We'll see about that.
This is like non-negotiable for me. Like Genesis is non-literal, but Paul is 100% accurate all the time.
If Paul is not 100% accurate, there goes like most of the New Testament, so he has to be.
Yes, like this is like the breaking point. It's like this has to be the thing. Anyway,
yeah.
I guess just to close, have you ever been to the Creation Museum down in Petersburg or in Kentucky?
No, but I want to go for one, and for two, I was going to bring up the Gutsip Gibbon YouTube channel account. She has an incredible 2-hour video where she goes. She's a primatologist and an expert in paleontology, things like that. She goes to the Creation Museum for the second time. She went as a kid. This time she goes with her mom, and she goes through the entire thing. She films herself in there like covertly because you're not supposed to, and she details and lists everything wrong with it, kind of like what Ben Stanhope does with his book, but she focuses on different things like evolutionary biology and stuff like that, and geology. It's a really good watch. So I would recommend it. But I would like to go to the Creation Museum at some point for amusement purposes.
Yeah, I went there 2 years ago. It's a hard thing to describe because it's such a particular version. It's not even necessarily like the most accurate version of the mainstream version of creationism, but it's definitely one of the most thought out ones. In a way, just because it's the one where they've put a lot of time and money and investment into trying to make this seem plausible. And, you and me being relative outsiders, it just comes off as comical. It's something I don't want to say. Because
I grew up with the Kent Hovind, canned ham kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So a lot of people I know have been to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. They loved it.
They sell copies of the Ken Ham Bill Nye debate on DVD in the lobby, even though I think history says that Bill Nye won that debate. So it's like you're I don't know why you're doing that, but all right, weird flex, but okay.
Hilarious. That's hilarious. Okay, but yeah, I definitely want to go. I feel like I've been there after reading Ben's book and watching that tour that Gutsip Gibbon does of the Creation Museum. I have to go. I have to go and laugh at it. I mean, pay my respects.
The death of science, yes. Yeah, I do want to end saying, like I said a couple times in this already, a lot of this, my concern on this comes from a place of, sensitivity and uncertainty. There's a lot of Christianity that I don't find to be questionable. There's a lot of it that doesn't bother me, but this is one of the scientific how this science and intersects with this is, because I do think it ultimately speaks to the truth of this, and I don't think it's an easy question. Obviously, the Bible is one of our best sources is our best source for spiritual wisdom and how we're supposed to connect to an all-knowing and all-loving God. But it doesn't, as far as I can tell, it's not meant to be true on all levels of reality at all times in all places. The morals are, for sure, but I don't think the elements of the history are. And I've met a lot of Christians who, when I say that to them, they think I'm an atheist, and they think I'm degrading the scriptures, and they think I'm doing horrible things to it. And I'm like, I'm trying to live in reality the best I can. If that turns me into an atheist, then I gotta go where the knowledge takes me, but I don't think it does. I still go to church. I still believe in Christ, and I don't have all the answers because no one has all these answers, and as much as I wish that there was a book that had every answer in the world that was worth knowing, wouldn't that be nice? Yeah, the book that I do have answers a lot of the questions, and I think it answers the most important one, is like, why do you get up in the morning, and why do you keep moving despite the fact that things hurt? Those are the two questions that matter. But yes. Carbon dating did not matter to the Neanderthals. So what matters 5,000 years ago on science does not matter now. But truth doesn't stop being truth, even if we don't understand it, which they didn't understand it and we don't understand it. So I don't know. You got to take what you can do, and hopefully when you get up to heaven, when unless you are in fact my friend here, and you don't believe in hell, and you go to hell anyway for not believing in it because you're a heretic, then who knows? Yeah, that would be the funny phase. Like, why did I go to hell? Because you didn't believe in it. But hopefully
I would be the only one. I'd be the only Baptist in hell.
the only people in heaven are clearly the Baptists. That's clearly the only true faith. But anyway, you can find her on Twitter at Darth Raider 117 if you want to hear all of her man-hating and heretical opinions, and tell her how much of a...
I don't have a brand. I just post whatever I want and say crazy stuff. So
yeah, she's not a public intellectual. She's just my friend.
No.
So she just says things and hates men as her want in life. So
if anyone wants to change that, he can. But so far, I still hate them. So.
There you go. She's a work in progress. But yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate talking through a lot of this. It feels like more of a therapy session than it should in places, but complicated.
Okay, people who are speaking the truth need therapy, and intellectual honesty is hard work. So
yeah, I hope anyone who's listening to this takes away that we don't know what we're doing, and we're just trying to figure out what we're doing, and I guess that's what sets us apart than other Christians, is we are acutely aware that we're stupid. This is all we can do. So.
Yes, very aware.
All right.
Yep, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions and cultural review podcast. Editing, hosting, and producing are by Tyler Hummel, art by Crystal Cali, and original music is composed by Guap Squad Gang and Melissa Lafira. Like, subscribe, and leave a comment below and tell us anyone you think would be a good guest for the show. Thank you for listening.